often talk about intergovernmental coordination, and I think especially when you're trying to develop compact communities, you run into the problem of conflict between transportation and real options for multimodal transportation implementations. And also you get some conflicts between what the region, what the South Florida Water Management District rules. So I don't know what are we doing towards refining those different policies and regulations to make it consistent and being able to really implement these compact communities.
The question had to do with when we're dealing with complex development, how do we deal with these, the larger issues of transportation and water supply and so forth that have regional or jurisdictional aspect. You know, one of the real values of the comprehensive plan is that if those are done well, a lot of those kind of questions are addressed. We're supposed to be looking at all those sorts of things. The better job we do of that in the comprehensive plan, the easier and more consistent that development review is going to be, so that you've already asked some of those questions. I suspect many of you know Andres Duane's name. Essentially, I was at a conference that he was speaking several years ago, and Andres described the development review process as a compromise among specialists. And that is true to a large degree. You've got the transportation engineers looking to make sure they have their issues addressed in the water supply. The more we can, the better job we can do in comprehensive plans in addressing those things, the better that process is going to work. Because if you don't address them until you're actually in a development review, you're usually not going to get a very consistent response. You will get that compromise among specialists, and sometimes you get the horse design committee.
Yeah, but for example, if you have a piece of land in a district where you implemented a form-based code where you can allow 100% of lot coverage because of the new type of density, but the South Florida Water Management District is requiring them to leave at 25% of their land for retention funds, when a retention fund doesn't fit anymore on this type of development. It's very difficult to coordinate because your regulation is saying something, your complaint says something, is consistent, but when you go outside your boundary to the South Florida regional, that's the kind of things where you find yourself in a pickle.
Yeah, you were constantly running into those kinds of issues. I mean, you could give obviously a lot of stories about that. I could as well. But again, that's one of the things we're trying to do within intergovernmental coordination, and one of the things we're trying to do in planning. We just don't always do it particularly well, and I don't think we'll ever fully solve that problem. But I suspect we do it much better than we would without any framework within which we were working. But I wouldn't suggest that we will ever completely remove that by any means. Question.
Thank you. Gene, you've been through the wars here for a number of years, and I'd be interested in having you step up to maybe 10,000 feet instead of down at the ground here. Looking back at Florida's growth management system, what would you identify as sort of the core strengths or the goods of the system, and alternatively, what are sort of the fundamental shortcomings from your view?
Thanks. I think we've done a pretty good job of beginning to address environment. We don't always get what we want to see, and you get the death of 1,000 cuts and so forth. But in the early 70s, as I think I mentioned earlier, the water management districts their mission was to drain the swamp. We are much away from that. Where I think we have the hardest difficulty is in the area of growth management and the ability to really contain growth. By that I mean in the sense of an urban form. What are the rules on which that's going to take place? I'm working currently on a study up in St. Lucie County on the Western Land Study. The whole issue is what do we do with 200,000 acres of citrus land that may not have economic viability with citrus. Enormous difficulties in terms of how we do it, and the system has not dealt with those kinds of issues very well. That one, for example, we tend to treat rural areas as simply urban areas in weight. And we're actually, in this particular case, trying to say, well, can we treat those differently? Can we really view them as rural areas that remain rural areas but have certain aspects to them that make them viable economically and so on? So I would say that the strengths have been in the environmental side, although with still weaknesses, and the great difficulty has been in trying to create some kind of urban form. And I'm not talking about whether we got a gas station on the corner, but whether or not, what that larger urban form looks like, some of these things that were being reflected by the myregion.org work and so forth. I also think that the intergovernmental coordination is a very weak element in Florida's law. And you have a lot of communities that talk to each other, but in terms of any kind of consistent and effective means of intergovernmental coordination, I think it's weak.
You talked about density. People do not want density. People do not want sprawl. But in the times that we are reaching our natural growth boundaries, density seems inevitable. So do you think in 30 years South Florida will form a distinct model for the U.S. metropolitan areas?
I don't know. I think that, I'm not sure I'm answering your question. I think that the word really, instead of density, ought to be design. People can sort of grab a hold of density and run with it without necessarily understanding what it means. But the density with design is often quite acceptable. But many times the decision that we have made are simply on that's too much density, and it's a huge difficulty, I think, for us. But if we can begin to recognize, let me give you an example. When we think, when I think of density in the terms we're talking about here, it doesn't mean that we're talking about high rises next to everybody's home. Hillsborough County, several years ago, we were looking at the rail system for the first time. We're still looking at it. But we made a determination that if the 10% of the growth projected for Hillsborough County, I think it was for a 20-year period, occurred in the city of Tampa, and we increased the density of our developing lands from 2 units an acre to 3 units an acre, we would need half the land. So I'm not talking about, we didn't have to start building high-rises on Tampa Bay. We simply had to make some shifts in design. It goes to the compact design, efficient design issues. We get those those are often not understood. And so I'm not sure I'm answering you the question at all, and I don't know that there are any great models, but terminology is a difficult thing when it comes to these kinds of issues.
I was going to ask, and you mentioned several of the external factors that influence planning, and I wanted to know whether people, especially the planning commissioners or elected officials, understand the subsidies, good and bad, that we have that induces growth, where we do or where we don't want it, or whether they're mostly still at this stage where growth is good, it's a public investment, there'll be a return on it in our future. What do you hear?
Well, I'm not sure so much what I hear, but what I see happening again and again. I think that as growth is being looked at, as development is being looked at, it doesn't tend to look at the broader picture of, you say, the subsidies. If I take the same 100 homes and I put it out 3 miles from the urban area, or instead of putting it inside the urban area, did I think about the road I needed? Did I think about the cost of the school bus? I would say that those considerations are not playing the kind of role in the decision-making process that they should. That may go back to my suggestion that the growth management part is where we struggle. And I think that very kind of question is part of that, understanding what those externalities actually are, and that you're actually subsidizing it over time.
Any more questions?
Well, I just thought that we're talking about success. I saw a line there saying that there might be other outcomes from a plan. And I think planning in the way we do it right now, we lack something, a kind of an element that would show us whether we are successful or not. I don't think maybe some of the people here would disagree with me, but we are in planning. But I could feel that we establish vision, we establish goal, but we do not have a way of measuring the performance or achievement of that goal in the first place. And I just thought it would be time for us to look into that aspect of putting in or creating a built-in framework, putting it down to science, measuring whether our plan is achieving what we are setting as a target, for example, for performance.
The question is, how do we just decide whether plans have performed? I don't know anybody that ever went back and looked at a plan they adopted 20 years ago to see what happened. I'm sure somebody's done that. And you could do it, but it isn't a situation where someone adopts a plan in 1975 and they have that on their desk for 25 years and they get to 1995 and they say, we've accomplished this. In the meantime, they've adopted about 3 or 4 new plans. It's very hard. It's also hard to do in the sense of this is a public community building. Remember that community building thing? You really are in the process of building community, not in the process of writing plans. It's one of those situations, I think, where if you were a developer, meaning you own the land, or if you were a city and you own the land you're going to build a fairground, you can build that and you can measure it, whether you made money, whether you were successful in attracting the mix of occupancy you want, all those kind of things. As a community, as the public, you don't get that. You're not able to do that in quite the same way. I took an exam once to become a AICP member years ago. It was an oral exam. We have a written one now. And they had us read some text. And there were 4 different theories of planning and growth. And there was a centristic one, and there were nodes, and there was a third one. And the 4th one was something called disjointed incrementalism. That's what we do. So how do you measure? That's what our process is. It's a lot of different decisions being made a little bit at a time. That's the public process. What the plans do is try to create a framework. No, it's very imprecise and very hard to measure. Follow up.
Well, I just thought that what we are doing is kind of an intervention. Any plan that we do is an intervention, and we are expecting a change. In any intervention, change could be positive and could be negative, right? Now, what we see in our field is that we do not put emphasis on the way we measure our performance. We just do plan and implement, and I think that is running counter to this idea of good management. We only plan, we only implement, but we do not look into that element of how we measure progress. Because I just thought that you say, if we do not recognize, we cannot know success in the first place, we might be rewarding failure.
I don't argue with that. Simply pointing out that I think the best that I'm not suggesting that you couldn't have a system in a particular circumstance where you did in fact measure that. But I think one of the things I'd go back to is, how do we build communities? Are you building the community on the ground that you want to see? Now, could that be measured? Well, certainly it can. Certain elements of it can. But it is a difficult thing to measure. Yes.
Yeah, I did want to follow up on his question because it points out the difference between the United States approach to planning and actually international approaches to planning, because we actually do not have benchmarks. We have goals, objectives, and policies that really say do good and avoid evil, but we have no measurable, quantifiable results upon which to rank or even rate our success. There are a variety of countries that have plans that actually are the capital budget. So the one thing that we miss is in planning in the United States, it has nothing to do with money to implement. If you look at either Asian or European countries, they have capital budgets that implement the plan.